We're going to get started on time here, unlike the previous class. So, you all know, turn off your phones. Okay? Tomorrow, right here on this stage, Wisdom Wednesday, and it's going to be a special World War II episode. It's Robert Kane presents his book, So Far From Home. I am actually familiar with this little piece. It's a very nice book about the training of British, French, and Russian pilots during World War II in the United States. So it's a kind of a lend-lease and training, so to speak. So yes, so many pilots did come here from those countries to learn how to be pilots. So it should be an interesting book. And with that, you know, I keep hearing this number. I wake up in the morning and I hear 476. And I go to bed at night and I think, 476. 476, 476, 476. Just keeps going on and on and on. I'm going, well, what could that be? Could it be a famous painting? The Spirit of 476? No, I don't think that's it. No, couldn't be that. How about a basketball team? The Philadelphia 476ers? No, I don't think that's it either. How about a song? 476 trombones lead the big parade. No, I don't think that's it either. But what I do hope, and I mean this sincerely, is that Dr. Kicklighter will grace us with at least another 476 classes here at Ollie. So, it is now my pleasure to present a man, 476 and counting, Dr. Joseph Kicklighter.
Nice. Thank you, Frank. The subject today is, I hope, a subject of great interest to us, and one that many of you have studied yourselves. So let me give a bit of a preface by noting that this is not a class on Islamic theology and history, so you're spared. It is, however, a subject of Islam for medieval people, because we have our needs, and one of them is an understanding of this influence as we are concerned with the Byzantines. Remember, the formation of medieval Europe occurs in the world where much of the learning, commercial activity, and what we would call civilization will occur in the Byzantine East and this Islamic South. So bear that in mind, and with apologies to those who were thinking that I was going into Islam itself, you will understand that time permits only a cursory look at that. But I do have time for him. I love this man. He is a god, one of the professorial gods of medieval history. He's been gone since 1935, but Paran was a name that would become legendary in the study of medieval history. And he's Belgian. So that is important because a lot of people, as you know, seeing in the movies, would always say, oh, so you're French. Hurtful things to Belgians. But he was super Belgian, very, very Belgian. And he had a reason to be, because he lived during World War I. He lost a son to the Germans, And he was actually imprisoned by the Germans, sort of like house arrest, for 2 years, 1916 to 1918. So he wrote a great deal about Belgium, but he was a medievalist at heart, which is a good place for a Belgian to be, considering the significance of his part of the world to medieval economic history. And indeed, that is what he did. He studied medieval economic history and studied, well, one of his major books was really on medieval towns and cities. And you say, well, why is that such a big deal? Well, as late as the early 20th century, people were still kind of doing kings and popes and that sort of thing. And he was one of your early social and economic historians, this Henri Perrin. So he is a very important figure. And I picked up this particular copy of the book because this is the copy that it would have looked like when I was in school. $1.65. So just, those were good times, yeah. I don't even think you could get a used copy for that now. But this is the book that most people, like say, if you were to go and say, when you think of Perrin, what book do you think of? Many people would say, well, I'm not so sure. But in the case of anyone who has a vague knowledge of medieval history, Perrin's most famous work was actually published posthumously. His son edited what was his father was trying to complete, and it came out in 1937 and is the basis for the so-called Perrin thesis. And basically this book, which is called Mohammed and Charlemagne, basically has as its thesis that without Muhammad there would not have been a Charlemagne. Yeah, I know, that's the idea. What does that mean? Well, it means basically that the Islamic world caused the West to become a separate entity. It separated East and West. How did that happen? Well, because thanks to the fervor of the prophet's message, Muslims cut off the East from the West. The West, according to Perrin, is sort of in on its own self. And that means parochialism, and it means the development of a separate civilization. Now, if you go to a medieval convention, and I know, I'm sure that idea is a real turn-on for you, but even if you will hang out with them at a party or something, and you just drop the Perrin thesis into the conversation, you could be a big hit. You know, they'll all look at you and go, wow, man, it's like you're one of us. I mean, talk about name dropping, that it works. So understand that, even though I would not think there are many people who still accept the Perrin thesis, that was the way it was. Why I'm bringing it up to us now is the fact that I feel as if Perrin made medieval historians appreciate the importance of the Islamic world to the Western world. And it's not just about understanding Islamic beliefs or military tactics or any of that, but it's to understand the cutting off of the West. We'll look at some other significances, believe you me, but it's to note that Perrin comes out with this idea of creating almost by isolating them, a new world. Not a very advanced one, but a new world in the sense of a Western world, with its own, as we've seen, Roman, Christian, and German characteristics. So that's Perean. And that's what he said. The Germanic invasions destroyed neither the Mediterranean unity of the ancient world, nor what may be regarded as the truly essential features of the Roman culture as it still existed. This idea, again, is not necessarily accepted in detail, but the thesis does make us realize that the coming of Islam in the 7th century was going to be fundamental in the development of the medieval world, which is not to say that contacts did not continue between East and West, but they would never be as much. However, Peren's idea that the Roman Empire went on much as it had in the past until the 7th century is no longer accepted. I hope that's clear. The growth of Islam is unbelievable if you think of the parts of the world that are in colors. Well, I don't need to tell you that brown area, we're hearing a lot about that in the news right now. So I don't need to mention that part of the world that was Arabia, except to note that while, as the textbook states, included some significant cities and much commercial activity, it was still a rather, an area of the world that a lot was not going on, let's put it that way. But, as you know, in the 6th century, Muhammad put it on the map, so to speak. And as he did so in the course of the 600s and into the 700s, the growth both to north and west was enormous. What that map will show you is not the full extent, because if you kept going east, it would still be going, and it did. But this was enough for you to be aware of how far it did get. Most of Iberia, as you see, and a bit into modern-day France. All of this is to say that it was a strong reality for the Western world and the Eastern, because lest we forget, much of the territory that will be taken by Islamic Muslims or Islamic Arab will be territory that had been Byzantine. So that's always to be borne in mind. It's not as if these are vacant lands that somebody can come along and say, well, I think I'll just settle here. No, I mean, these were lands with people, and they are now part of an Islamic world. A very profound change in the world, and a very powerful influence on the people of our concern, who will be the people of medieval Europe. What are some of the reasons? Those that have been brought up include, and again, who knows what is primary, but it is said that Arabs were very good at military matters, and they had been utilized in wars of other people, mercenaries, I guess you would say. And this was not unusual in the past. For example, being used, and I think this is ironic, by Byzantines and Persians. Yeah, when you think then who's going to have the last laugh? Well, it's going to be these Arabs. But they were, you might say, experienced at fighting. And I suppose, like all tribal people, they fought among each other, say, you want to fight? And they say, who you got? You know, it's sort of like, that is not a problem. In other words, they are involved in trade and so forth and so on. But they are also involved in fighting. This is just part of the culture. Now, the fervor of religion. This is often brought about. It's often been mentioned, and I think accurately, that Christianity developed rather quickly too. But it never was able, because of its historical background, to take over the amount of lands that we are talking about in this particular amount of time. Christianity spread through missionaries and then ultimately through governments, as we've seen, a la Constantine and Theodosius, right? So they said, you're going to be one. Whereas the Muslims are not necessarily converting people. They're just taking over where they live. And for a time, they're not basically, because, you know, as is pointed out, I mean, many people are told, well, you're not Arabs, so we're really not interested in your joining our religion. The idea that that the Islamic religion would become universal is a very significant development. But they are taking over the lands. And again, if we went into the theology and the idea that that is one of the Islamic duties, to rule over lands in the name of God and that kind of thing. So this is a reason for Islamic fervor, ruling over lands that are, as they say, infidel. And as such, many of these lands are vulnerable. I think that's the best way to put it. They are susceptible to this kind of attack. And we think, when we think of Byzantines and Persians, we always think of like two boxers who've really been at each other for a long time. The wars, well, and maybe if I just say Romans instead of Byzantines, it'll make it even more clear. Gosh, Persians and Romans had been fighting for the longest kind of time. You think of areas that we call Iraq now, and other areas back and forth and back and forth. And the Persian Empire grew. Remember, they were based largely on what was Iran, and as far as they could into what had been Hellenistic territories, as far west as they could go. All of this is to say that these wars went back and forth even from the 2nd, 3rd centuries. And that is to say that both empires were very vulnerable when the Arabs come along. And the theory is then, not to take anything away from the military skills of the Arabs or their religious fervor, but to note their enemies, that is the two that are about to be conquered, weren't exactly at the prime of their game. That is what we are told. Now, this is one I particularly like because we've talked so often about the heretics. Jews and heretics were not well accepted in the Byzantine Empire, to say the least. Remember Monophysites? Remember these groups? There were many of them. And many of them, it is said, now come to despise the government who has persecuted them. I mean, you can hardly think they are going to go big B. I mean, it's not like, wow, we really want to help you. We want to buy bonds. How can we want to get in there. Canned food drugs. No. Over and over again, you get the idea that whether you're in Alexandria, Damascus, any of these great Byzantine cities, there is more than a little, well, they pretty much got it coming. Whether you are a Monophysite or a Jew or any of these other groups, you have little reason to support the Byzantines. Take your chances. These new folks say they believe in one God. Okay, sounds good to us. Particularly if you're an Arian. Yeah, lest we forget. It's like 476, very near and dear. So yeah. I mean, Arians, you know how they felt about the Trinity? It was a big no-go. And now these folks are coming along and say, oh, y'all don't like, you're not into the Trinity? And they say, no, you're not either? Hey, give me a hug. Okay. I mean, it's an interesting idea that they were comfortable that way. Now, the Persian story is a little bit different because, of course, many of you know about Zoroastrianism. Very interesting religion. And I believe there are some, but not a lot, in various parts. India, for example. I think there's still some in Iran. Yeah, the Parsi, exactly. But in all cases, a minority when we consider the size of it in the Persian Empire. And again, it's hard to know why the Persians will succumb to the Islamic religion as they did, or to the Arab military forces. But again, they had expended, I suppose, a lot in their wars with the Byzantines. So both empires are weak, but not just for religious reasons. Also, they provide a form of toleration. If you don't know the term people of the book, it simply means the prophet believed that Jews and Christians had as much truth as they could have at the point they had it. If that makes sense. It means, in effect, it was truth, but it was incomplete truth. And only by following Muhammad, the prophet, which was the last word on the truth, would it be complete. But the people of the book, so they said, were entitled to toleration. That's an interesting word, isn't it? Toleration. We're hearing a lot about it nowadays, like, well, if you say, you know, it used to sound really nice, but I think now folks are saying, oh, I don't like that. Oh, that's not enough. But the toleration means, in effect, if you say, well, I'm a this or I'm a that, and you live in a Muslim society, nobody's going to say, well, I'm sorry, but that's not acceptable. That is what it meant for Christians and Jews. Now, there are a few little issues I need to raise here. First of all, they didn't care what kind of Christian you were, right? They didn't care what kind of Jew you are. Because neither one of you is really the totally correct group. We're tolerating you and nothing more. So if you say, yeah, well, I'm a Christian, they say, and then you say, do you want to know which heresy I'm following? They'll say, no, you're all losers, okay? And there will be special taxes. Oh, we love those taxes. Yes, you really want to hurt people, tax them. So there are special taxes, and you can't hold office. And so there are areas, I guess you would say, of discrimination against non-Muslims when they come to rule. But there is an answer as these societies mature or develop: conversion. And that, of course, will occur in many instances. That doesn't mean there will not be Christian and Jewish minorities. It's just there is an alternative. You can maintain your incorrect religion if you wish, but it will not provide you with all of the first-class citizen rights that Muslims have. So that's what I think we mean by toleration. But you couldn't have gotten that in Constantinople. You couldn't get that kind of deal. So this is something, and I don't think that the Persians were exactly grand about just whatever you want to believe. It was officially by this point Zoroastrian, but I'm not sure that this made as much a difference for Persians as it did for Byzantines. Whatever the case, when the Muslims sweep in, so to speak, they do provide toleration, and it seems to have aided their cause, perhaps made their cause more attractive to the many people who were neither Persian nor, what shall we call them, Byzantines, Romans, Greco-Romans. Whatever we call these people, they are the rulers, aren't they? And the rest of the folks are saying, well, we're just exchanging one group of rulers to another. But look, this new group, I think we'll get a better deal. I think they're going to be nicer to us, and we can be part of this group through their policy of conversion and toleration if we choose not to. It is a very, very significant factor, because when you think about how these societies are transformed from one religious group to another, I don't mean all people, but I mean a heck of a lot, will become Muslim in the process of the conquest. It is a remarkable to me tale. And again, the idea is so far removed from reality of the Arabs coming with the Quran in one hand and the sword in the other. Is, I don't think anyone accepts that anymore or even believes it. It's an idea that obviously there are advantages to conversion, but it's not the same as being forced into conversion or not allowing Christians and Jews. And so there they were. And this would be, of course, not merely in Alexandria, but it would be in a variety of other places in the Middle East, as, for example, in Palestine, Syria, and many other places, as we will see. As we look at this map, now we get to see more specific areas, and we understand the times that they were taken over. See the incredible shrinking Byzantine Empire up there? But then look at what's happened to the Persian Empire. There isn't one. That's gone. Just sweep. Go all the way over and you say, I believe I remember Alexander the Great going this way. Yes, he did. We're going talking about getting over into Pakistan. And of course we know, predominantly Muslim population. Because in most cases, not all, but in most cases where the Muslim faith and culture came, it never left. It became a part of the people. I mean, think of Iran. Think of Pakistan. Think of the various places. It's not like, oh, we're just coming here for a few hundred years and then, we're out of here. No. That will become permanent. Now, we look at the green area, of course, as being the original followers, that is, the Arab people at the time of the prophet himself. When we move out into that kind of limeish color, I guess you'd say, we go into what we call the companions of the prophet during the 7th century. Then we're going to go on to the dynastic families that will take us through this course, through 900. As we get into the West, we go up from North Africa. You say, gosh, wasn't that ruled by the Byzantines? Yes. And if you're really a scholar, you'll remember those Vandals. Remember they had ruled? Yeah. I know we get very nostalgic when I mention things like that. And then you start thinking, but what about the Visigoths? How are they doing? Not well. Okay? Not well at all. You think, you mean, yes. They had converted the Visigoths from Arianism to Catholic Christianity, and you say, wow, that's great, good for them. Well, you didn't save them from being lime-colored, did it? No, no. So, a little too late to get on the bandwagon. They hung out for, Arianism. It seemed like a good idea at the time, not working for you later on, is it? So, many of the areas, particularly in Iberia, we will see become Islamic, and then, as we know, will be, how shall I say, restored to Catholic rule, which is another interesting story. But let us note that with that exception, most of the world you see before you is, even today, at least nominally Islamic. I'm choosing my words carefully. I mean, it is Islamic, but it doesn't mean that everybody who is Islamic loves each other. That's a nice, it doesn't work that way. Okay, sometimes there's problems in relationships, and we'll see some of that as we move on. But it's simply to note the sheer quantity of lands and the area areas, I should say, had consisted of the Roman Empire, Byzantine, and the Persian Empire. In other words, lands that were far more developed than the lands that had been possessed by the Arabs. Because let's face it, that one syllable word that's meant so much and that we loved so much, oil, was not a factor in this time. I think that's what they call a game changer, but another class, another course, okay? Because that's what they call modern history. So we don't do that here. Scary. Oh, how do you like this? Lord, they had some action. But why wouldn't they? What would you call that if you wrote a book or some sort of the battle that saved Western civilization? Yeah. Again, you say, can't you give us more years that we need to remember? Because I know. You're not the only one, Judith. I mean, there are lots of other people who are looking for a new year. And here's one for you, 732. And that, of course, the battle when groups of Muslim forces made it as far as France, Tours, France. The Battle of Tours. And can you imagine when that battle was determined? And we'll go into it later on. But at this point, I'd like to note that the Muslims had expanded northward. They were defeated by a Frankish army. And I'm going to tell you, when you can just imagine if there were agents there, maybe church agents who were there, like journalists, and they got, talk about spin at papal headquarters, you know. Think about that. Church defeats horrible, brutish people. That's the Battle of Tours, and that's the way it was taught in the books. It's like the wicked and the evil are now, they've got their comeuppance. How dare you come up into France against these nice Catholics? And you see what God did, don't you? Beat you. Because you're bad. You say, well, now, is that really going to keep them out? Well, no, but it's going to be, I think, a sort of spirit that will be manifested in campaigns in Spain, the famous Reconquista, or campaigns later known as crusades. In other words, that sort of fervency and excitement in terms of the two people. The Battle of Tours then was not, I think, meant to be as important as it was. But that's no reason that you can't learn and have forever. 732. See, you've just got to wait. With 800, the coronation of Charlemagne. I mean, you've got so many days. I mean, it'll be like your whole list of telephone numbers and passwords and things. I mean, the mind is a wonderful thing. Yeah, we want to keep it. Now, look back to our page. Look at these folks. You say, and there's even a woman there, and you say, what's she doing? I think they just throwing in all kinds of folks, you know, like Grandma, you say, the butcher, the baker, the counselor. Everybody is there coming for this, but we know, of course, righteousness will prevail against these awful people in the Battle of Tours. What makes it important, of course, as far as the Islamic expansion goes is that as far as Europe is concerned at this point, it's over. And we don't really know whether they seriously were going to move up there and say, shoot, we can probably get to up around Belgium, the Netherlands, who knows, Scandinavia. But in fact, it may have been merely to feel out the situation where they felt, and that was the end of that. But 732 will remain embedded in our mind day after day, year after year, in case of a quiz. Yeah, there would just be dates of my dream, my fantasy. Okay. Now, they didn't always have it great. That's what we always, you always get this idea of, oh, it's just smooth sailing for them from the life of Muhammad. No, no, no. They had lots of problems. We start off with the issue, which actually is going to be an issue for Christians, earlier times. And that is, you'll recall the issue of whether only Jews can be Christians. Remember that? And now, Muslims are going to have to face that in their own community. They had already determined, because I think the prophet himself, I think it's very shocking for me to say that the prophet knew Jews and Christians in his own life in Mecca, and may well have benefited from talking with them and learning from them. However that may be, the question of how or who could be a true Muslim would be an issue that apparently was settled in less time than Christians had to settle with the issue of Jews and Gentiles, but it was long enough that there probably were divisions. However that may be, no one has ever shown me anything written in the Quran or elsewhere that would indicate that non-Arab Muslims are in any way inferior, that they are all the faithful. More importantly, however, is the struggle for power. It does not appear that Muslims, like Christians, had so many theological issues. You don't hear anything about, but they're not going to have Trinity issues because they don't believe in that. They are strictly monotheistic. There is one God. And so there is never a question for Muslims of having to deal with those kinds of issues. As far as I am aware, the issues are going to be about leadership. And that will be very, very serious. And when does it begin? That's an easy one to answer. Muhammad's death. Like so many people, I suppose, he definitely should have, but did not make plans on a succession. And the result, of course, without going into details in this, it will create problems from his death onward. And this will go on for years and years and years. Without going into all the details, note there were 4 successors, caliphs, who will be responsible for much of the military victories and territorial acquisitions. They were all people who were close friends of his. And then they will be followed by dynasties. But what it will boil down to is this. Again, I repeat, this isn't, of course, in the details, but just so that it's clear that the question will come about, should the succession be determined by being a blood relative of the prophet, or should it come about by some sort of caliph's succession? And that's the way it will work, and there are still divisions in that world based on those kinds of differences, Sunnis and Shiites, as you are aware. The family, put the capital F there to indicate Fatima, the only child, as far as I am aware, of Muhammad, was married to a cousin named Ali. So the smaller group who are known as Shia today believe that that's where the successors had to come from. I often ask myself, if Fatima had been a male, would that have made a difference? Just speculation, I don't know. But you think about it a minute. Ali, who was Fatima's husband, he wanted to be leader, and he had some supporters, but he had some that didn't support him. I don't think people would have been so feisty if he had been the prophet's own son. I mean, he was the prophet's cousin, and he was the prophet's son-in-law. Still not son. You know how blood is. So, that's just a thought. Fatima and Ali, and then opposite these dynasties, Umayyads and Abbasids, and the one with its headquarters in Damascus, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, later in Baghdad. And there was some ugliness there. And I'm trying to be euphemistic, Carolyn. I'm trying to use nice words. There's some hurt feelings. And there's some obituaries, yes. I think that's fair. Just let me know that these caliphates, well, I can tell one little story. The Umayyads, when they lose out to the Abbasids, there'll be one Umayyad left. They tried to make a clean sweep and they failed. And he ended up ruling in Spain. And we'll see that shortly. Now, we also note that we will get to the stage that the Turks are coming. And we think about, again, we think about our current events and Turks and Saudis, not to get contemporary on you, but I was just thinking, isn't that interesting, if you want to get relevant, that these things happen, and you think they are all Muslims, but that doesn't mean the love is always there like we would like it. So, to note that the Seljuk Turks, not the same as the Ottoman Turks of World War I, but a very important group. The Seljuk Turks are going to be a major factor. And we'll see more of that when we get to a map of all this. I mentioned Baghdad, and Lord knows nobody needs for that to be pointed out on a map, right? There was a time, but certainly not in the modern ones, we've known about Baghdad. And that is interesting that the Abbasids would move all the way east to establish what would have been one of the greatest cities of that particular era. If you had been talking about Rome, certainly not Paris or London, but if you were talking about Rome, they would go, that cow town, comparing that to Baghdad, or Constantinople, Alexandria, then that would make it very, very unlikely that those places could have compared. But I did want you to note how much they conquered. And you say, but Cordova, what happened? They lost it. I know, it's sad. Well, it is Muslim? Yes, indeed. But it's not our kind of Muslim. We've got splits. Where is the love? Yeah, you see the division then already that we will have separate. The Abbasids were at the height of glory, and of course, I could not mention them without bringing up the great scholars like Avicenna. These people are the sorts of people that the West didn't have. The West did not have Greek, for example, or if they did, it was extremely rare. You'll notice his dates. He was a Persian, but they'd converted. You say something about Zoroastrianism, you say, yeah, my granddaddy, I think he was one of those. You know, that kind of thing. It's like, that was way back then. That was kind of, and now he's part of the establishment, but he's also a scholar. And we know him because of his knowledge of the classics of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. And many of his writings, which would then laboriously be translated from Arabic into Greek, into Latin, would then be a kind of intellectual filter into the world that was less blessed with those kinds of knowledges of medicine and otherwise. In other words, the West was far behind both Byzantines and Arabs. Another that I didn't get to put up was an individual who affects us all who've studied philosophy. And when I say the name Thomas Aquinas, that will turn on several people here. And you say, why would you bring up the great Dominican in this discussion? Well, because his great source for knowledge was Aristotle, but it was Aristotle through a Muslim scholar named Averroes, or at least that's what they called him in the West. He lived in Spain, and his knowledge was enormous. Knowledge of Greek philosophy. He basically had read, commented on, translated the greatest hits of Aristotle. And you're thinking, wow, he didn't have a lot of free time. No, he was a very busy scholar. And he came out with ideas such as that what we know through human reason is complete of itself, as opposed to what we know through Allah as taught by the prophet. And you'll go, that sounds suspicious. I don't blame you. I think you're right to be suspicious. You smell a rat, and you should. Faith and reason? You mean they might be in difference? I think we better have a little chat here in headquarters in Cordova. And yes, he will really be troubled by the differences. He will be disciplined. So that happens in the Islamic world as it does on occasion in the Catholic world. Sad to say. Because of the differences of faith and reason. I just thought that was interesting as we go through this. Now here come the Seljuks. What I want you to note here, as you see the orange and green, is yet another group. We have the Seljuks taking over what had been the Abbasids. The Abbasids lived a good life. You know about Arabian Nights and all of the caliphs and their incredible, what do we call it, lifestyles? Lifestyles of the rich and famous. These folks live very well. And the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people, will come in, convert to the Islamic religion, and say, we really love you, you're a wonderful caliph, and now that we are part of the Muslim faithful, can we help look after you? And you say, I feel suspicion, and rightly so, because we understand that they will take over this area, leaving the caliph. Well, he's there with his harem, and he's got his activities, but he no longer has power. And this area, which you see here in green, will now be ruled by the Seljuk Turks. And you'll see why I'm mentioning this a bit later. The area you see led by Cairo, and Cairo, by the way, is a new town in this period, will be led by a dynasty who claims descent from you-know-who. That's right, Fatima. These folks, and nobody really knows. I mean, it would be interesting, you know, if they had their papers and all that, but I don't think. But they claimed they were descended, and they claimed as such to have the authority of Muhammad. So they rule basically that particular area. And you say, but I miss my Spain. Where's all that? That didn't make that map. That's the last of the Umayyad family. Remember the one that didn't get killed off? So we'll leave that alone. But that's the way the Muslim world was at this time, just generally speaking. And you say, but it's a broken family. Yes, I believe so. Not unlike the Christians. There are lots of different ones, lots of different groups who have formed. Meanwhile, let us consider what the effects of Muslim success really will be, because the successes are going to be enormous. Not necessarily that the Muslims intended them to be, but they were. And of course, as in everything in life, you can't go back. It's always go forward with a new situation. And as Perrin or any other scholar would have said, now with the Muslims, there will be a permanent series of effects. Whether or not they liked it, and I think it's pretty clear they didn't like it, the Arabs will now be led by this dynamic religion, which, as one scholar said, puzzled and angered Christians because it was enough like Christianity to interest them, but at the same time madden them. It's not something, in other words, that they could simply dismiss. As it spread, scholars in the West particularly, but elsewhere, would argue, why is this religion so successful? One theory was it was founded by a fellow who didn't get pope. Yeah. There was an election, and maybe he got Mr. Congeniality. Yeah, you know that can hurt. And he said, well then, to heck, I'm being nice, to heck with you all. I'll have my own religion, thank you very much. Let me see, what will I call it? Oh, I'll call it Islam. Now, I don't think many people necessarily accepted that, but you will understand we call this the problem of Islam in the medieval West. And they did have a problem with it. I mean, there's a problem at the Battle of Tours, clearly. But the problem I have in mind here is almost theological. Why would God allow this? Because I thought we were winning. You know, and now these folks come along and they mess it all up. And like I say, it could be, you know, somebody's sourpuss because of losing an election, and that's always hurtful. But then there are other factors too. Second, oh yes, the Arabs and the non-Arabs. Of course, they'll say, sure, come on, Turks, we love you. You ain't heavy, you are brothers. Or some such, yeah, right, sure. There is always that, and if you doubt me, you could ask Lawrence of Arabia in 1919 at Versailles in Paris. I mean, it's like the differences between Arabs and Turks instead of significance in the Islamic religion. And again, if it's not theological in Christian terms, it's more about the leadership. Who's in charge here? And many, of course, will come to claim those positions of leadership, and as a result, the Muslims, like Christians, will have these terrible differences. I think we have already spoken of the Sunnis and the Shiites as the classic example of differences. An effect of even greater significance to Westerners, that is to say, Catholics, would be, of course, the flow of information, because the West is truly benighted. Whether it's Spain, whether it's Sicily, other places where Muslims are in leadership roles, their scholarship will emerge. They have the access to the information, and I guess as important as anything, they are willing to let others have it. They often talk about how many translations works like those of Aristotle and Plato went through on their way into, yes, Carol, our beloved Latin. And you say, well, I can get it now, but you think about going from Greek to Arabic and then going from there to Latin. Wouldn't it have been better to have just started with the original? Yeah, but they didn't know enough Greek to be able to plow through Aristotle's works. All of this is to say not merely Aristotle, but a host of other writers come through the funnel of Muslim scholarship. Like Averroes explaining Aristotle to Westerners. And that's why our hero Aquinas will be so excited about Averroes. And you think, well, didn't he think it was kind of unfortunate that he had to go to Muslims? Hell, that's part of being a scholar. We go wherever we need to. And that is what he does. So it's fine to accept their learning in all these different fields, but that doesn't mean we have to love them unless they convert. So the whole scholarship issue is a fascinating one. Whatever economic issues there are, the issue of intellectual transmission is always the best. It's the one that will last. And it unifies these areas in a way that religion separates them. Because obviously they're not going to agree. You know, that old expression, we'll agree to disagree or something like that. I don't think they reached that level of understanding until maybe the 13th century, when in Dante's Divine Comedy, he has a special hangout for outstanding Muslim scholars. They don't get to go to heaven, please. But they don't have to go to hell either. So it's like a nice place for Greeks and Romans and Muslims, whatever. So, I mean, that's about as far as you're going to get in terms of being on the top list for a Christian, because there is obviously going to be a lot of bitterness. Well, of course, you knew I would have to say the C word. It was coming to a lecture like this. Crusades. But I tried to preface the reference to Crusades with all the differences that were going on within the Muslim world. We are far from ready to discuss the Crusades, but I want you to be aware that from the Muslim perspective, they may, or a group of them, may rule over Jerusalem, the Holy Land, but they are far from united. The very territories that Crusaders were so excited about were among those territories that would slide between Fatimids and Seljuk Turks for control. In other words, it's like studying the Cold War and you think, oh, but they got everybody together and solid. And no, they too had their divisions. And as we will see, the Crusades, which in many ways began in Spain, who can forget the Song of Roland, with the idea of preaching against the Muslims in Spain. Because now we have discovered the they, the other, and we got them, and they're right across the mountains. Let's go get them. Because they are the ones who are messing up the world. When in the later times, that is, the crusading times, the authority over Jerusalem and the idea of ruling that part of the world will be much more of a factor. But it had already been there. That sort of feeling of those people, somebody's going to have to conquer them, somebody's going to have to bring them down, because we are the Catholic Church. And we love the Pope, and the Pope loves us. And all of this has to be developed. All of this takes time. Centuries, in fact, to develop that kind of unified devotion to a cause. And that's what will make these such interesting events. On the other hand, as I've said before, Crusades fought against the Muslims beg the question, but exactly who are the Muslims and who's going to be in charge here? And that will make the difference. I have to end early today, but thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.